Typically, I have a microphone to do this. I'm a very soft speaker, so I apologize if you can't hear me. I'll do my best. But yes, I am here all the way from Las Vegas, specifically for you, not DevOps Days London. That's just an afterthought, but I'm here for you all. And one of the talks that Kev reached out to me for was on code reviews. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. So who here knows this emoji? Raise your hand. Who has given this emoji? Who has regretted giving that emoji? Never? Not at all? Yeah, I have regretted giving that emoji plenty of times. And it's kind of become this infamous, LGTM, looks good to me, right? In the context of code reviews, which if any of us are not familiar, that's the process by which we hopefully take part in, but check each other's code before it goes into the main code base. And sometimes reviewers kind of give us this thumbs up, this LGTM, this, sure, it looks great, merge it into the code base and everything should be fine. But a lot of the times I've found that not a lot of folks feel that way. A lot of the times there are many things that can go wrong and a lot of things that don't make it look so great. And so what I want to talk to you today is, what are we doing wrong in code reviews? How do we fix those things? Because there are plenty of things that we are doing wrong. And how do we go beyond bare minimum code reviews? So the things I'm going to talk to you today, what we fix, are things that I feel should be what we always do all the time. After we achieve that, then we can actually go on to do some other neat things that go beyond what I consider the bare minimum. So what are we doing wrong? In order to take a look at what goes wrong in code reviews, we need to look at it from two perspectives. We need to look at it through the reviewer and the author's perspective. In my case, I know there's a few different ways that we can look at code reviews more synchronously. Maybe you do it through email reviews, but in this case, we're going to go through where there is a reviewer and there is an author in the reviewing mechanism. And so we'll start with the reviewer. So number one, not leaving your ego at the door as a reviewer. This is number one. The funny thing is, when we go through code reviews, my very first code review, I was a junior .NET developer in this very small, medium-sized healthcare company in Las Vegas. And I was eager to learn. I was working with, it was like SSIS packages, and I was trying to put together something for some health data for a dashboard. And I put up my first code review to our senior. And, I was excited to get their feedback. And the senior was like, this is stupid. This is terrible. You should not have done it this way. This is the wrong way to do this. And I expected some of that, but I did not expect it to get it so harshly. So that really, really made an impact on me early in my career, that I did not want to be this really harsh, kind of terrible reviewer that almost pushes people out of software development just because they didn't know any better. And at the time, I didn't know any better. I was looking, I was eager to learn, but that wasn't the best way to go about it. The next part about this is focusing on the developer rather than the code. So that's exactly what this developer did. They kind of focused on me saying, didn't you read the documentation? Didn't we go over this? And it may very well have been the case that I missed something, I misunderstood something, but they kept on asking why I was so stupid, essentially was the case. And rather than focusing on, this is why we don't do this, this is the convention here, this is what our naming standards are, you are missing an edge case in this particular piece of code that you wrote, rather than focusing on those items that I could constructively apply that feedback to, I was just getting more like, well, you know what, maybe this isn't for me. Maybe I'm not supposed to be in software development. Maybe I am stupid. Maybe this isn't for me. And so this not only exists in my own experience early in my career, but I've spoken to a lot of developers who say they've run into this exact same scenario. And that's really, really unfortunate. It pretty much feels like this. When I was writing a book, or I have finished a book on code reviews, which is why you'll see somebody wrote an entire book on code reviews, that's me. I was researching for this book, and there was a study done that was focusing on detecting interpersonal conflict in issues and code review. And one of the interesting findings I found here was that the use of second-person pronouns at the beginning of the sentence is more likely to be seen as impolite by the person reading that comment. So they took a look at a bunch of different comments, And they scored them and said, these are the ones that are statistically more likely in toxic comments, meaning people read them and rated them as toxic. So you'll see those are the words there. And they also statistically rated those that were non-toxic comments. So those are all the words there. Might be a little difficult to see, but as they have noted, those in the toxic comments, there's a lot of focus on the developer. You want, you are, if you think, do you think? And the only exception to that in the non-toxic area was could you, which is more of a way to be more polite when asking for a change. But overall, it was a very interesting finding I found in this particular paper. The next thing that we do wrong as a reviewer is we skim through reviews. How many of us have done this before? I've done it. It's Friday. I need to go somewhere. I have a vacation. There are many really silly reasons why we may say, let me just get through it. I believe it. And we go and just give it the looks good to me. There are other reasons why it's not so great. Maybe you're the bottleneck, you're the lead, you're the senior, and you're always the one who's supposed to look at code reviews. You're part of every pull request, and you just have to not hold your team back. So sometimes some of them you just, sure, I trust them, it looks good, or sure, this one will be fine. And that's not what we should do. What is the point of the code review if we're not giving it a thorough review at all? So this is another really big issue that we come across as reviewers and what we do wrong as a reviewer. One of the big things that contributes to this is that we have this mindset, most of us who might do this, that when the developer has a bug in their code, that it's their fault. So even if it got through our review, we're okay. We have something to blame. We have some peace of mind to know that it's not necessarily me who had the fault. And so that's why we're more likely to pass on and quickly review some of these pull requests or go through these reviews very quickly. Lastly, one of the most important things that we have, a responsibility that we have as a reviewer that we do wrong, is to write ineffective comments. So ineffective comments are the cause of most of the debates that we have. Ineffective comments are the cause of misunderstanding and confusion between the reviewer and the author. This is what prolongs the request before it gets approved. So ineffective communication really is what is the bottleneck here in code reviews. And most ineffective comments I've found are in the form of three things. They're either very, very subjective, so return the result in an array instead and leave it at that. Why in an array? What's better about it? What do you need me to change it to this for? It comes across as a subjective suggestion rather than something backed up by something objective. Sometimes ineffective comments are unclear. This could be better. And that's it. You're left to find out what could be better. You figure out what could be better. You figure out what could be improved. And lastly, they lack an outcome. So there's something wrong here. And then again, you are left to figure that out. As an author receiving this feedback in a code review, this is part of what makes it grow and cause so long. Bless you. And it requires you to work a little bit harder to get onto the same page of what the reviewer was trying to tell you to do, what mindset the reviewer was in, what is that exact feedback that they are leaving for me. So ineffective comments are subjective, unclear, and lack an outcome. And these are the top 4 things that we do incorrectly as a reviewer. We don't leave our ego at the door. We focus on the developer rather than the code. We skim through reviews very quickly, and we write ineffective comments. So how do we fix those things? Well, first and foremost, we focus on the code, not the developer. And I think it's skipped there. Forget your ego as well. These are 2 things that we should hold so closely to us in professional software development that it shouldn't even need to be said. But yet here I am, 2024, reminding everybody that leave your ego out of the door and focus on the code rather than the developer. If we go back to that study that talked about toxic versus non-toxic comments, you'll find another finding here that says many of the software engineering related engrams, test, pull request, the pull, all of these things that are focused more on the code itself are among the non-toxic comments. And if you go back to those lists of words that they found, that seems to correlate. Anything that is focused more on the actual code or the pull request was labeled more likely to be non-toxic, with the exception of could you, again, because it is a more formal or a polite way to ask for a change. Next thing we should do is proper, thorough reviews. We know this, yet we always find a reason why we might need to skip through them. But if we really take the time to understand that proper, thorough reviews yield us the benefits of doing code reviews in the first place, this is something that we should try to strive to continue to do and try to lead by example on our team. Part of that is that sometimes they just take too long, right? Sometimes we squish all of the pull requests to view and review all in one time and we get burnt out. So one of the things that we try to say is to review code in more short focused bursts of 25 to 45 minutes, because that's when we're less likely to lose focus and be less likely to want to skim the code review in the first place. Another thing, do not be afraid to actually send back PRs that are too large. Sometimes we just trough through it. We're like, oh, okay, fine, let me just do this. But if no one single person can go through 500 files and be expected to properly give a review, it should be okay on your team to say, this is too much for me to review. Have you removed all of the items that are not related to this change? Did you remove anything that's unnecessary? Is this scoped down to an atomic change that I can really focus on and really understand and check for in my review? Most of the time, they're not. Most of the time, there are things that cause the pull requests to be so large that it is impossible for any of us to do a proper review. So don't be afraid to send back PRs that are way too large to review. If we go back to the mindset of where developers, well, they have a bug, and even if it goes through that it's their fault, really what we should be thinking is, how did I miss that? That's our responsibility as well as a reviewer, not just to say, there's a production fire, they're going to solve it, but we should have some accountability as well, that if we had gone through and properly actually gave this a review, did we really truly give it our best and make sure we checked for all the things that we have agreed as a team to check for? Finally, the most important part that I think that we should do as reviewers is to write effective comments. So effective comments are the opposite of what I've told you are ineffective. They're objective, they're as specific as possible, and they have a focused outcome. So being objective, being reviewers, we always need to focus on the code as much as possible. And being objective also means we suggest with facts. We don't just suggest things out of the blue. We try to back them up. Or if we are about to ask the author to make a change, let's say there's some rework or something that we want modified, we should pause and ask ourselves, why do we want to make that change? There was a really interesting study that was done on this, and they found that before reviewers were about to leave a comment for the author on something to change, they took a minute to think about it, think about what they were about to ask them. And what it resulted in was either they were so sure that, yes, this is a necessary change because they were able to make it make sense in their head, and thus they were better able to articulate it in the comment that they were about to write. On the other hand, what they also found was sometimes they couldn't make sense of what they were trying to ask at all, which meant that this wasn't a necessary change, or they were able to find within some self-reflection that this was just something they needed to work out in their own head, and it wasn't necessary at all. So before you suggest a change for an author, rather than just spitting out and writing a bunch of feedback and comments, it is worth it to take some time to see if that change is really warranted before causing some potential unnecessary rework by the author. After being objective, the next thing that's most important is that we have to be specific. I think most of us do this, and the tools that we use allow us to do this, but it's worth noting to always do it, especially when leaving feedback. So being specific means be clear if something actually needs to be done. I don't know how many times I receive a code review and I see all these comments and I'm like, great, those are all action items I need to take. There's something that needs to be done there. There's something I need to do. But when you take a look at them, that's actually not the case for every single comment. Sometimes some are more informational. Sometimes they are nitpicks. Sometimes they are just questions. So they're actually not work at all or things that I need to change or update, but it would be a lot faster for the author to know, to be able to categorize and say, here's the top priority things I need to address. Here are the things that I can ignore, and here are the things that might be good to know or to talk about with the reviewer. So who here nitpicks? You can, don't be embarrassed. I did it too. Usually we try not to, but again, that depends on your team, right? Sometimes teams are very, very adamant. No nitpicks make it into the code review at all because they're a waste of time. They're literally a nitpick. Other times there might be a reason to say some sort of nitpick because you have that kind of communication with your team, you want to hear about each other's opinions, but you still need to clearly label that it's a nitpick, that nothing needs to be done about that. Don't just leave it as a plain comment. And taking this notion of labeling something a nitpick and then adding your nitpick comment, we can do some other things to classify comments. So my team, we used comment signals, which is the same thing, they're prefixes. And we had needs change. So anytime there were smaller changes or fixes that needed to be done, we would use the needs change prefix or comment signal. Other times there was way more work that needed to be done. Something was way off track, something was required a much larger change than just a small update to the PR. That's where we would use needs rework. And we would take this offline, discuss it, and either say, close the PR and say, we need to completely redo this, this is wrong, or do something else with it. And then we still did have nitpicks, but we really, really tried not to use them. So those are the three that worked for our team. They were able to categorize the majority of comments that we left on our team. And some teams might need more, some teams might need less, depending on the types of projects that you're working on. Another example of this is conventional comments. So who here has heard of conventional commits? Raise your hand. Yes. So this is the same person, or not the same person, but the same thought, but they have applied it to comments. So Paul Slaughter, who I actually got to talk to and we did a podcast together, he asked me all these questions about the book, but he mentioned that comments were one way of being able to standardize the format of comments and to also be able to parse them if needed later on. And so the difference with conventional comments here is that they have a label, they have optional decorations, and then they have the actual subject or the comment itself. So you can see as an example here, they use praise, which is something I also encourage. If you see something really, really novel, it's almost like a code compliment. They have nitpick, they have suggestion, they have issue, they have a to-do, question, thought, chore. They really, really broke it down to almost every kind of category that you might need. And one thing that I liked about conventional comments is they also use decorations. So for example, you can distinguish a suggestion that's more security related by adding the security decoration versus something that's a test minor type. One other decoration I really, really like is to use if it's a non-blocking versus a blocking type of comment. So these are the things that you really should address this. I'm not going to approve this pull request unless this is addressed versus non-blocking. This is something that might be concerning, but isn't necessarily so problematic that it would block the overall code changes from being merged. So if you're interested in a more structured, organized way to label your comments, then that might be something you could look into. The next thing to be specific is to pinpoint what you are talking about. Sometimes we're in a wave of code and you may not know exactly what the reviewer is talking about. So only highlight the relevant code that you are discussing. Most tools allow us to do this, to highlight exactly what you are talking about, but make sure that you actually highlight what it's talking about. Sometimes I've received code reviews where they just highlight the entire method and the method is really, really long. And that's another story, right? Why is it so long? But the method is really, really long, and then I have to go through the actual full method just to find exactly what it is that they're talking about. So if you can pinpoint just a few lines or the very specific portion of the code where you are asking about it or leaving feedback about, that's even better. You're surgically precise on what it is the author needs to look at. explicitly call out method, variable names, class names, and then if necessary at all, even go so far as to call out the line numbers to be more succinct. It might be a little bit of extra work, but what this does is it gets you onto the same page as the author that you're leaving feedback for, and the faster you get onto the same page, the faster you two can align, and the faster that this pull request can be gone through the process. Finally, we need to provide a focused outcome in our comments, especially if we're asking somebody to make a change. So in that particular study, a different one, where they looked at language in code reviews, one really interesting finding here is that this is now talking about comments that are useful versus not useful. Comments that contain some sort of transformational verb were likely to be more useful than not useful. So what this led me to develop is something that I like to call the triple R pattern. If you're having trouble formulating how to ask somebody to make a change, this is one really surefire way to get all of those things into a comment. So it is the request, rationale, and the result. 3 R's. Request, what do you want the author to do? Rationale, why do you want them to do this? What's the rationale behind the actual change you're asking for? And then result. What's the measurable end state of the change that you are asking for? Is it an actual metric they have to hit? Is it a screenshot of what something is supposed to look like? Is it the actual refactoring of how code should look if it's maybe a junior developer that you're working with? But some sort of measurable end state that the author can compare to say, this is what the reviewer is asking me to do. So if we put that into practice, let's say you wanted to ask somebody to move a method, request. Can we move the authenticate user method into our library? Why? Why are we doing this? I would receive this and ask why. Well, the rationale is we have similar methods that are already in this library. We also have this being called more than a few times, which warrants its place in the library. And we also have a team agreement that advises us to put this kind of code or authentication behavior in this particular library. So we have 3 objective pieces of fact, 3 facts, not just me saying it because I want it to, 3 facts of why I'm asking for this change. And then, of course, the result, you can forego this. It should be pretty clear by now what you want the result to be. But you would say, please move all of these calls into the library and make sure they're not standalone. As another example, if you wanted to request a more meaningful variable name, again, can we rename the variable item to something that is less ambiguous? Rationale, other than it being really ambiguous in this particular scope, it's vague and it loses the notion of the discounts. Result, change the variable name item to something that's more meaningful. And here is where you can now add your suggestions. Sometimes we just put the comment, change item to this. And what is a more meaningful variable name can be very subjective. It can come across as subjective. You ask 2 developers to pick a variable name, they will come up with 2 different things. So what is meaningful can be very, very subjective, but aligning it in this way and asking someone and giving them suggestions in this way will make it more likely that they might just accept the name that you are trying to offer without it coming across as name it this. And finally, there are pull requests or code reviews where the discussion is just going nowhere. You're 6, 7, 8, 9 comments in, or if you're going back and forth on a specific comment and you are 3, 4, 5 back and forths along, that's a sign that says it's not going anywhere. You're talking over each other. Take some time to just take it offline. Go to each other, whether that's, if you're lucky enough to be in person, tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, let's just talk this out really quick and not get lost in translation on the screen. Or go on a quick video call with your colleague and talk it out. Talk it out and figure it out, because that is the faster way, I guarantee you, than to do it asynchronously. And the most important part about this that I think nobody really reminds people is that, let's say you take it offline and you discuss what it is that you're going to do about this, you get aligned on it. The most important thing to do is to go back to that PR and actually leave a comment with the outcome of your conversation. Because if you don't do that, then you've practically siloed yet another piece of information, that discussion between just the two of you. So if you decide, oh, we've talked it out and we figured out that this has a lot more rework to do, put that in a comment in there. Now, anybody else on your team, even yourselves, a few months later, goes back to that PR, says, whatever happened to this? And then you see, oh, we took this discussion offline. Here are the main points of what we agreed to, and here's what we're doing next. And now people know, oh, that's what happened to that PR. Now they're going to look for a new PR because you said you were going to rework it. Or we figured this out, we talked this out, this is actually not needed, somebody already merged that change 2 weeks ago. Now you know, this is closed and this is why. So go back to those pull requests, anything, update it with a simple summary of whatever it is that you talked about offline, and you will spread that knowledge to the rest of your team and not create more silos within your team. So those are the things you should be doing as a reviewer. Forget your ego, focus on the code, not the developer. Go through the reviews and actually do your job. Go through them and write effective comments. So now we know what we're doing as reviewers. As authors, we have a lot more that we are doing wrong as authors. And so now we're going to go through what we're doing wrong here. The first thing that we do not do is to we don't be our own first reviewer. We don't take a look at our code. We don't clean it up for the pull request. We kind of just open a PR, send it over the line, and we're good. We're done. Dev complete, right? Now it's just the reviewer's turn to look at it. Ideally, there's no feedback, and we are done with our job. However, there are so many times where questions that the reviewer asks could have been solved by adding a little bit more context, putting a label on. Sometimes there's typos or missing information in the PR description that if we had just taken some time to take a look at it, we clean that up. Sometimes we have some console logs or any debugging code that's left. Yes, we should be running automation to take those out in the first place, but that's still our job. Did we actually run that before we open the PR to make sure the code is ready to review? There are all these different things that we should be doing as an author right before we open a PR, but we don't. So in this case, we miss a lot of those tiny little things that, again, prolong the code review process. Similar to that is we might not be using any automation at all during development. Sometimes we don't use any linting, we don't use any formatting, it might be the same tool, we don't use any static analysis, or we don't have any automated testing. These are things that should be done during development. These are things that can be done before the pull request, before the code review. I don't know if you have ever been in a code review where you're arguing about formatting or missing semicolons or spacing. It sucks. It takes so long. It's so subjective. It's not worth it. As a reviewer, you're wasting your time on low stakes issues. Is this something you really want to be reviewing? Something that a robot could have caught? Something that your IDE could have surfaced for you and fixed beforehand? That's what you don't want to be focusing your time on. So any of these lower stakes issues, things that can be automated away during development, are highly, highly suggested to be done before the code review. The next most infamous thing that we do as authors is we just make them really, really unmanageable. And by unmanageable, I mean we make them really, really long, really large. There's too many files. The changes aren't atomic. We could possibly stack them for the reviewer. So the reviewer's like, wait, I was just reviewing this state of changes, and now you just made an update, and now I'm reviewing this new state of changes. If you are doing a large feature, sometimes multiple parts of a large feature are in a single PR. So again, it goes back to if the PRs are super, super large and unmanageable for a single person to take a look at, then we're not doing our jobs as authors. We're not taking the time to break it down into something more manageable, something that we would be happy to be reviewing if the tables were turned. And we also not only do that, but we also treat the PRs as mystery novels. How many people have received a pull request to review like this? Anybody? Or like a single line. You are spent time snooping around like, and you're just looking for all the links to anything to tell you about what this potential bug fix could be. That's all you know, that it's a bug fix. That's it. You are left to put the pieces into place, and you are left to spend, again, a little bit more time figuring it out what it is that you're trying to review rather than reviewing the code at hand. Lastly, the thing that we do wrong as an author is we tie our worth to our code. So code, sometimes we think of it as an extension of ourselves. Sometimes we spend a lot of time crafting a solution and we think it's this perfect thing, and we send it off to be reviewed, and somebody leaves feedback and you go, how dare you? This thing is perfect. What do you mean there's problems with it? And that's also a problem, because that's not who we are. And more importantly, when feedback is being left, constructive feedback, effective feedback, that's an opportunity for us to make the code base better as a whole. So just as we're asking the reviewer not to focus on us, we have a responsibility to also not take things personally when we do get feedback on our code. So that is something that we also need to remember as authors. So what we're doing wrong: we're not our own first reviewer, we don't use any automation during development, we make our PRs really unmanageable, we treat them as mystery novels, and we tie our worth to our code. So fixing those things, be your own first reviewer, take the time. I mean, even when I write an email, I double, triple, quadruple check it to make sure there's no spelling errors. Use automated tools to help you check them. Use those things at your disposal to make sure that it is properly prepared for the reviewer and that it will go along faster. Anticipate any questions that your reviewer might ask. Get those lost pieces of knowledge that you still have because you've been working in the weeds and understand the context. Make sure that's all there so that when the reviewer goes to look at it, they have it too. Let the robots take over during development. Again, I already talked about this, but the more that you can do beforehand and take care of before the code review, the more that those will be taken out of the code review and will be less likely to delay the code review as a whole. I don't know if you've ever remembered the show Captain World? Do you know where they have the rings and they like put them all together and then they summon Captain World? Nobody knows that show? Maybe it's an American thing. So this meme makes no sense to you, but I'm trying to say, with the powers of formatting, static analysis, linting, automated testing, and you, a pro automation developer, you will now result in no more annoying code review issues. Make PRs manageable, aka make them smaller. If you need a few more guidelines, there are a few that I have found during my research while writing this book, but these are all guidelines. Focus on an atomic change or a feature, meaning one single action that is to be done in the code. Include only what's necessary for code changes to work. Don't mix configuration changes with refactoring changes. Make sure it's a single item that you're asking somebody to look at. Split multiple parts into multiple reviews and talk with the reviewer about how you're going to handle the review process. So if you have multiple parts that depend on each other, work that out in a plan to say, here's the first part I'm going to review and this is what it's going to do. Here's the next part that depended on the last part but can now be reviewed, but this needs to go first. Walk out that plan rather than just sticking it all into a single pull request for your reviewer to look at. Manageable PRs likely can be reviewed in 10 to 20 minutes. The less time that they take, the more likely the reviewer is going to actually look at it. The smaller that they are, the less likely the reviewer is going to say, oh, this is way too long, I don't want to do that right now, skip. The quicker that they can be reviewed, the more thoroughly that they can be reviewed. Anything that can be reviewed in 10 to 20 minutes is a good guideline. Another study that was done by a principal engineer, Dragan Stepanovic, he found that code reviews that were under 500 lines of code were more active, meaning any code reviews that had less than 500 lines of code had more comments. And you might be thinking, more comments? That doesn't sound good. But what he means is that when you have fewer lines of code, you actually have reviewers taking the time to thoroughly go through your code, which likely results in more comments. That means there's a greater chance that they're actually going through your code rather than just skimming it, rather than just saying, looks good to me, and then you find out that there's an issue later on. So that's one other guideline that is from Dragan Stepanovic. Another study based on Microsoft was they found that typically less than 20 files changed were the more effective code reviews. So they had a bunch of code reviews done. They took the different attributes of them, and again, they found smaller code reviews were more effective. They didn't have as many back and forths. They actually progressed through the process a lot faster, and the developers felt that they were effective at what they were supposed to do, meaning it was supposed to be reviewed, things that were supposed to be found were found in the review, and it was able to go through and did not feel as much of a bottleneck as larger code reviews. So these are guidelines. Again, I have folks come up to me, take a picture of this, and then they kind of say this is law to their team. This is not law. These are just guidelines on how to make your code reviews more manageable. What works for your team is best, but this is a good place to start. And something that we forget to take a look at is when we design smaller features. So let's say, folks come to me and say, when we get to the pull request stage and it's already too large and it's already too late, we can't do anything about it. It's already been designed this way. Or someone says, well, this is a feature. This is a single feature, and it just happens to be this large. If those are some familiar sounding cases, then I always say try to take a look at your design and planning phases, because if you're designing features that are way too large, the resulting pull requests are likely also going to be too large. So if you can find ways to minimize that scope, to break down those tasks into parts that will be manageable to review, then that's something that you will thank your future selves for later on. So in a nutshell, designing smaller features means you gain smaller PRs. As part of that, also solve the mystery. Let your PRs tell the story. So I like to tell authors that they influence how long the review lasts, and you decide how well your PR is prepared. You can leave it blank, like the one that I showed you, where you're not supposed to do that, or you can make it really, really context-filled, full of information, so good that the reviewer doesn't even have to talk to you because you have just prepared it so well. That's the goal, anyways. One quote that I like to think about when talking about this is from Yamamoto Tsunetomo in his book, and he writes, when one is writing a letter, he should think that the recipient will make it into a hanging scroll. So if we take that mindset of when you create your PR and you add all of the information in it that you think the reviewer will need, but not just that, if you ever have to reference this PR in the future and you have all of that information in there, this is now a very useful artifact for your team until the end of time. So thinking about it in that way makes it a much more effective PR. And a lot of people say, well, that takes too much time. That's so much effort. You're telling me I have to write all of these things? And I promised I wouldn't talk about AI in any of my talks. This is the only time I'll talk about it. There are tools that are AI powered that will help you do these. The things that I agree with, I don't say AI should take over the entire code review. It can't. But what I do agree with are there are AI tools that generate summaries for you, that calculate how long a pull request is supposed to take, that auto-label things for you, that check that the titles of PRs are to a specific format that your team has done, that generate change logs. These are the tedious bits, but the useful bits that you can use and add to your pull request to give it that long-lasting, useful permanence, rather than you manually writing it out yourself. And to juxtapose the blank one right here, right, we have a nice, really context-filled title. We have labels, we have the linked ticket items, we have context, we have linked to documentation, we have some pre-build checks that are already running and passing. That's the ideal state that we want to get to so that there's less time on the reviewer to focus on those things manually, and they can just focus on reviewing the code. And finally, remind yourself that you are not your code. As much as we feel like it is, we are not our code. So any feedback, any constructive feedback that we get, again, is an opportunity to improve that code. Don't take it personally. Don't take it as an attack on yourself. Don't feel like you are less of a developer because you receive feedback. You're just not your code. You're making the whole team's code better if you do receive feedback. And those are the things that we should do as an author. Be our own first reviewer, let the robots take over, do all of that stuff during the development we can fix, make your PRs manageable, aka make them as small as possible, solve the mystery and let your PRs tell the story, and remind yourself that you are not your code. And finally, that is the bare minimum of how code reviews should actually work. Like, they will really gain you the benefits that you probably seek if we are doing all of those things, both as a reviewer and as an author. So how do we go beyond that? Well, I have a few ideas. The first thing we alluded to is to create a team working agreement. Does anyone here have a team working agreement on their teams? Ah, lovely. Okay. Team working agreement. This came from the world of Agile, Scrum. That might be good or bad for some of you. But what team working agreement does, specifically for the use case of a code review, is you explicitly write out the implicit expectations of your team for code review. This is the thing that you write together. This is the thing that you enforce together. And this is the thing that you evolve together. So one of the really good things to put here is, what is your actual code review? You'd be surprised that if you ask someone, what are the steps of your code review, they would not be able to list out what all of those pieces are. So that's one really, really good thing to add is, what's your workflow? What is expected? What are the states of PR review that you're trying to do? So for example, some teams use the whole swath of states where we have a draft state. And if you use a draft state, people use it in different ways. Some teams use draft to indicate this PR is not ready to review, skip it. Or some teams use draft to indicate this PR is a work in progress. I actually want to get feedback on it because it's an MVP or it's a prototype, or I want to make sure I'm on the right track before actually committing to an implementation. So if your team does that, it would be very helpful to designate what your team follows and what that means. You have ready for review. That's pretty obvious. This is ready for you to review. You have in review. Some tools use this already for you to indicate that it's actually being looked at. Sometimes you can add extra states. So for example, needs fixes. This could be an optional state. And then obviously the one that we're all familiar with, approved. But having the list of what states you actually use as a team, again, is very helpful for somebody to know how to work through their review, and is also very helpful for onboarding documentation, helpful for anybody who's going through the process and may have been forgetting a step. This is all stuff that the whole team should know. And as another last example, what are your blocking issues versus your non-blocking issues? So teams have very different ideas. Individuals have very different ideas. This is not a blocking issue, and you get into an argument because they're holding up your PR because you're blocking it. But somebody else thinks, no, this is a grave error that should be addressed before it gets approved. So again, this takes a lot of conversation and discussion with your teams to actually discuss and agree, what are your blocking issues? What are your non-blocking issues? And when you have that in the team working agreement, you can now use that as part of your rationale in your comments. You have an objective piece that you all agreed to as a team that you can use and reference to say, this is why I'm asking you to make this change, or based on our standards, this is what I need you to change. So all of these things are things to consider adding when you create your own team working agreement for your team in your code review process. If possible, use PR templates. Who here uses PR templates already? Awesome. So you already know how useful these can be, especially if you have different types of pull requests that you are going through. So some can be very intricate, right? That's markdowns. You can add whatever you need to. You can have an example bug fix PR template. This is one that we used, which was very thorough, but very good. And it asks anybody who opens a bug fix PR, what's happening? What are the reproduction steps? What is the root cause, since you're the one who's proposing a fix for it? What is the actual fix? What was the testing strategy that was used? What is the impact of this? Are there any other parts that may be impacted? Is there any regression risk? And then a last minute checklist that the issue number has been linked, that we have fixed it, tested it locally and confirmed that it works locally, that new unit tests have been added to prevent future regressions, and if applicable, relevant documentation has been added. and then any other notes that you want to share. So anytime in one of our teams, if we had a bug fix, we tried to fill this out as much as possible because it gives as much context as possible to whoever is reviewing. And this is also very helpful because when we need to go somewhere or need to vacation or on PTO or wherever, they don't bother us. We've stuffed all of the information we possibly have into this and will likely help the reviewer get through the review more quickly. If possible, there's also a thing to auto-assign reviewers. Does anybody here use the code owners file in GitHub? Awesome. Does anyone use the equivalent in Azure DevOps? Did anyone know there was an equivalent in Azure DevOps? All right, awesome. So auto-assigning reviewers, we do this to, number one, prevent bias. So obviously we want to pick the best reviewers to review our code, those who are experienced with it, those who are experienced with the technology or the language. And anytime we get the right people to review our code, that's typically a better code review. And you can do this with auto-assigning reviewers. So with the code owners file, this is a file in GitHub that you place at the root of your repository. And with some file patterns, you can have the PR auto-assign specific people or specific groups based on what files have changed. So for example, if I just did a star.js and added a group to that, anytime a PR is open that has JavaScript files change, it will add the people that you have specified to those PRs automatically every single time. And you can get very, very fancy with your patterns. You can say all JavaScript files go to this thing, or only this specific folder. Anytime any changes in this part of the code base only go to these, or should always have specific people assigned. This is the very, very useful part of auto-assigning reviewers. In Azure DevOps, you get the same thing. It basically generates it, but if you go to your branches and you go down to the very bottom of policies, it is this block right here. It is the automatically included reviewers policy. And you can add a new policy, and this is exactly the one that I just spoke about. So any pull request that has JavaScript files change, you want me to always be added to that pull request. So you can change this around, you can change the patterns here, and you can set up multiple policies depending on who you want to always be assigned on your code reviews. And one other thing to explore are informational reviewers. Does anybody use informational reviewers at all? It's kind of new. There are some teams here who use informational reviewers. So they add folks, and their purpose is to just be fresh eyes on the code. And their purpose is also to help spread that knowledge and share that knowledge, but they don't necessarily have to approve the pull request. The goal is to get them more familiar with code that they may be unfamiliar with, and their goal is to continue to build up their skills and familiarity with that code so that they eventually do get to a state where they can be able to approve those pull requests. There was one German development team that I spoke to, and they went really hardcore with this. They use informational reviewers, so they add folks who may be new to the code, but they do give them approval privileges. And the caveat there is, if you are approving a pull request as an informational reviewer and something does go wrong in production, then you are assigned to do the fix. You are the one who's supposed to do the fix if it does go wrong. And for them, that has worked because you have empowered them to say, I have a meaningful approval vote as well. I'm not just somebody who's reading. I'm a part of the team. I can contribute. And they have all the time to talk to the original author to really learn what the code is doing. And then by having that other piece where if something does go wrong and it's their responsibility to fix it, that's the accountability there so that they just don't approve anything and say, yeah, that looks good to me. So that has worked exceptionally well for that German development team that I've spoken to. Lastly, we're at the end now. Code compliments are very encouraged, but within reason. So I'm not talking about every single PI. You're like, great job. Oh, this looks great. Or, every time everything is great. Everything is happy. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about if you find like a really novel solution that your colleague has developed, or somebody has fixed a bug that's been plaguing your team for months, or they got to a really, really good metric and it is just really, really impressive to you, that's worthy of giving them a compliment. And this is the only time I will say that you do focus on the developer, but slightly. You are praising them for developing something really, really cool, really novel, and why not? We don't need the code review to always be a critique and a negative thing, but in the chance that you do find something really awesome, say so. And that is it, .NET Sheffield. Don't settle with your code reviews. Please, please, please strive for great ones. Take one tactic, take all the tactics, take this talk about it with your team. Just kind of start the discussion and get it going. And hopefully there's at least one or two things here that you can take away today to start using with your team. So, .NET Sheffield. If you really, really like this talk, come talk to me. I have more, I'm not gonna answer everybody's specific team situation. I've had many different scenarios that are different where these might not fit, but please come talk to me. And again, I wrote an entire book on this because that's how much I like code reviews. So if you like this talk, please feel free to check it out. It should be in print by Manning in October, but based on the behind the scenes copy editing, it might be a little delayed. But thank you, that's all.